All right, good morning, everybody. Good morning, Mr. Matthew.
Hi, good morning, Bang Robert. Morning, everyone. How are we?
Okay, is everyone ready? Okay, good morning, everyone. Hope everyone of you is in good health and mood for today's lecture. All right, allow me to introduce you to today's lecture topic. Disputes sometimes arise not only among private actors, but also involve public actors, such as state. What is the role of a state in settling social dispute among its people? What options exist when people have disputes? Mr. Pierre is going to enlighten us with his lecture on resolving disputes in conflict-affected areas. Examples for Myanmar and southern Thailand. Mr. Matthew finished his Bachelor of Law from Australian National University in 1996, and he obtained his Master of National Law from University of Sydney in 2003. Mr. Matthew has over 15 years of experience managing diverse access to justice and research and analytical programs in the Asia-Pacific region. He has a long experience as a consultant for the several World Bank's Office program in Indonesia, Solomon Islands, Thailand, and Myanmar. Currently, he leads evaluation and operational reviews and support the development of policy brief for Australia Awards Indonesia's program in Indonesia, including leading analytical work on Australian Awards Indonesia's targeting policy to support access for vulnerable groups and co-authoring a new alumni engagement plan for the Australian Embassy. Based on his experiences, Mr. Matthew is undoubtedly a proficient speaker for today's lecture. All right, everybody, without further ado, let us welcome Mr. Pierre Zurstrassen. Bang Matt, the floor is yours. Before that, allow me to share your material.
Sure.
All right, can you see?
Yep.
Material?
Looks good. Thanks very much, Robert, and thank you everyone for joining this session. It's very nice to meet you all virtually. It was also lovely to see all of the Indonesia promotional videos before. It made me want to come and visit Medan again and Sumatera Utara again. So today what I wanted to do was to present to you about how people go about resolving disputes in conflict-affected areas and how that varies, how that's different to the process of resolving disputes generally in the public. But before we start, I wanted to give you a little bit more of a background about myself because that will explain a little bit why I think this topic is important and why it might be a topic that is of interest to you. My understanding is that all of you participating in this seminar either are legally trained or are currently studying for your law degree in universities. I understand most of you in universities around Indonesia. Having a look at the participant list, I see a few of you are from Far Eastern University, which I think is in the Philippines, right? I'm wondering whether or not is there anyone joining from any other countries today, Bang Robert?
I think they are from India, Malaysia.
Okay. Okay. Can I? Are there any participants joining from Thailand at all?
I don't.
Okay. I'm just checking to see because some of you will have some familiarity with the material that I'm going to present and may have very interesting and different points of view as well. Also with Myanmar, if I assume there are no participants joining from Myanmar, people of Myanmar descent. But if there are some of you that are joining from Myanmar, you will have very unique views on this discussion as well. But let me give you a little bit of background about me first, to help you understand a little bit more what I am planning to talk through. Like many of you, I have a law degree. I studied law in a Bachelor of Law and a Bachelor of Asian Studies in Australia. I then was admitted to become a legal practitioner in Australia. And from a very long time, I've been very interested in public law and in how law affects public policy. So when I was working in Australia, I was working in NGOs, non-government organizations that provided legal support to people from vulnerable groups. And then I did a Master's of International Law, and I've always been interested in the role of law in the development process for countries that are for developing countries, in particular in the Asia and Pacific region, because I, as you may have guessed, I'm from Australia. And I feel that the Asia Pacific region is our neighborhood, and I'm very interested in the region and how Australia engages in the region. So from that background, I then went on and started working on justice sector reform programs, primarily in Indonesia. So these are programs working with the Supreme Court in Indonesia, and working with the Ministry of Law and Human Rights in Indonesia. But my work in this area made me understand that actually these institutions are very important, but will very rarely come across these institutions. And in particular, people of lower socioeconomic groups, poorer people, they have very limited engagement with legal institutions. But that does not mean they don't have legal problems. It just means that they look at different avenues to resolve their legal problems. And so my interest comes from there. And so my interest is what we'll be discussing today is much more of a socio-legal background, much more in the space of socio-legal studies, and looks at the link between social research and the law, and why that is important to understand the links between social research and the law. Your role in the future as lawyers, as academics, as government officials working on law is to understand how you can provide services to the public that meet the needs of the public. The law, like any other area, needs to be responsive to and provide a service to the public. And so my interest in my background and my interest is understanding how the law can be used to support the public in general, but mainly people from a more vulnerable background, how it can be used to overcome inequalities in the state. And in many instances, the law creates inequalities in the state, and how we can be familiar with those inequalities to be able to try and overcome those inequalities and provide opportunities for people more broadly. That's my background. I started working with the World Bank in about 2004. I have developed I spent about 10 years focusing very specifically on access to justice and dispute resolution processes, specifically in conflict affected areas. So my experience started in Sri Lanka. And then I spent 3 or 4 years working in Aceh. This was immediately after the memorandum of understanding between the Free Aceh movement and the government of Indonesia, looking at the reintegration of my specific area of focus there was looking at the reintegration of former combatants, former GAM combatants in Aceh, and the types of social issues that presented for people in villages in Aceh, how to support the reintegration of combatants to support the peace process. I have then spent about 5 years looking at access to justice issues across the Pacific. I was an advisor to the Federal Court of Australia and the Chief Justices of the Pacific nation states to support them on access to justice in Pacific Island countries. And I spent a year in the Solomon Islands specifically working with the World Bank to look at village courts in the Solomon Islands and how the government in the Solomon Islands can improve village courts. And then I spent about 4 or 5 years. I spent 6 months in southern Thailand in Pattani, and we'll come to that. Many of you, I'm sure, have never heard of Pattani, and will be very surprised to hear that there's an ongoing conflict that is going on in Thailand. I spent some time there, and then I spent about 4 or 5 years doing research, leading research projects in Myanmar, including research projects on access to justice and on dispute resolution processes in Myanmar. Now, as Bang Robert has said, to tell you the truth, conflict research in conflict areas is a little bit tiring sometimes. It's a great privilege to be able to work in these areas and in most cases live with communities, interact with people. It's a real privilege to understand the cultures in these areas and really complex problems. But it is tiring, and I have a young family, and it is not always helpful to family life to be traveling all the time. So for the last couple of years, I have been working in Jakarta on an Australian education project. I say that specifically for you all to understand that what I am speaking of at the moment, what I'm proposing to discuss today is something that I had a great degree of knowledge on, but have not worked on for the last 2 or 3 years. So some of the areas I will be discussing have changed over that time, and these contexts change quickly. And I say it also just to confirm to you that what I am talking to you about today, I'm saying in my own personal capacity, and I'm not presenting on behalf of any institution, whether it be my old employer, the World Bank, or my current employers. So I'm sharing my experience from a personal capacity, and hopefully it is of interest to you. I'm happy for you to ask questions throughout or collect questions at the end of each section. I have a preference for as interactive an approach as possible, but I understand that the format, be it Zoom, is not always the best place for an interactive approach. I also hope that you understand my accent. It's not the world's easiest accent. It's an Australian accent. It's actually a mix of a European and an Australian accent. If I'm speaking too quickly, please let me know in the chat, and I will endeavor to slow down a little bit. And if you have any questions, please let me know also in the chat, and Robert or one of the moderators, please kind of pull me up if there are questions, because I will endeavor to look at the chat a little bit, but I have multiple things going on my screen. Okay, so as we are now, we've got the presentation in front of you has outlined what I want to cover in today's session. It has provided some very informal topics or guidance notes for the sessions. I want to give you a little bit of an introduction of what we're going, definitions of what we're going to talk about and areas we're going to talk about. After that, I want us to spend some time talking about the process of dispute resolution, and this is mainly in rural or country areas, in more remote areas, often in poorer communities, and in conflict-affected areas. So we want to understand, if someone has a problem, if someone has a legal dispute, what do? Who do they look to for help? And who are the key actors in these areas? As we go through that, we will come to an awareness that the key actors often are village authorities. And so we want to spend a little bit of time talking about what their role is, and most importantly, how difficult a job it is to be a village leader in a conflict-affected area, and why those challenges exist, and spend some time understanding that. Then we will go on and we will spend a little bit of time talking about communities or people within communities who have the biggest difficulties in conflict-affected areas. People who have limited options in resolving their disputes, or who maybe are not able to access anyone at all to help resolve their disputes, and so they have to suffer in silence. So that's the structure I'm proposing for today's presentation. We are going to talk about, primarily, I'm going to give you a background on my experience, my most recent experience. So that is on work based on work that I've done in Myanmar. In many of you will call it Burma. In a lot of the English-speaking world, we call it Burma. I guess the ASEAN countries are more likely to call it Myanmar, and I think it has now become more common practice to refer to it as Myanmar. We will spend some time looking at the other blue dot on the other blue arrow on that screen, which is the deep south, what is often referred to as the deep south of Thailand. So the two blue arrows are the arrows where I'm going to focus most of my energy. But as a comparison, I will occasionally make reference to my experience in Aceh. And in particular, a study that we conducted, and I'm not focusing too much on this because it's quite old now, but a study that we conducted, a survey we conducted over 10 years ago in Aceh and in the Maluku, looking at the process of access to justice in these two provinces in Indonesia, and particular because those provinces were both at some stage affected by conflicts. And I may reference my work in the Solomon Islands. Again, it's work that the Solomon Islands, many of you, I don't know to what extent you're aware of Solomon Islands. Our Australians are quite familiar with it because it's a neighboring country, but it's a country that experienced quite a lot of local communal conflict over 15 years ago now. And so it is a post-conflict country in definition, but again, the example is less relevant to the topic of this discussion because the conflict context is a bit older. Having said that, it is a country that is continually faced with unrest, and so the physical violence that occurred may be rare nowadays, but it still has underlying connotations of conflict affecting the country. So they're the areas of focus I'm going to look at. If we can move on to the next slide, we will. What I want to talk a little bit to you about is what do we mean by conflict, and what does a conflict-affected area mean in the context of East Asia and the Pacific. I do not know how many of you here will have been familiar. Hopefully none of you have had to experience a conflict context. If some of you, if many of the participants are from Medan or from Mosul, then some of you may have links with family and so on in Aceh, and so may have had the unfortunate and unpleasant experience of experiencing conflict in Aceh in the past. Thankfully, overall in Indonesia, it is a much less common occurrence than it has been in the past, but it is not a less common occurrence in the East Asia Pacific region, and sadly, a number of countries in the East Asia Pacific region continue to experience quite serious and quite serious conflicts that have a consequential impact on the lives of many people that live in those areas. Makes us think about conflicts between countries, between nation states. But most of the conflicts that we see in East Asia in particular are defined as subnational conflicts. And a subnational conflict is a conflict that occurs within a state. And in most cases, it involves a conflict between the government of that state and smaller armed groups looking to control territory in a particular geographic area of that state. And in many instances, it's a small geographic area. It's not a large geographic area. But there is a conflict, what is often referred to as a vertical conflict. So a conflict between an up-down conflict between the nation state and the army of the state, and actors within one particular geographic area of the state. So if we look at the example that many of you will be familiar with, the example of Aceh in the past was a subnational conflict. It was a conflict that was restricted to one province in Indonesia between the government of Indonesia and primarily between a group called the Free Aceh Movement, acting on behalf of, or claiming to act on behalf of representatives of the Achenese people. The issue with subnational conflicts is that whereas it is often a conflict between a state and a smaller group, it is also, as the slide shows, a conflict where there are often competition between what we refer to as elites, between influential groups in that area. So conflict between people that are trying to influence politics, trying to represent different ethnic groups, trying to represent business often in those areas. So they use the uncertainty that's created by the state conflict to try and exert their own influence. And sometimes, and often most these are when the circumstances are most serious, it breaks out into communal conflict. So this is conflict between different groups within a particular area, different ethnic groups, different religious groups, and so on. And so one example that many of you will have heard of in recent years is the instance of the Rohingya in the west of Myanmar. And to a large extent, that is what is called a subnational conflict between the government of Myanmar and people of Rohingya Muslim descent in the west of Myanmar. But, and sadly, that has also broken into communal conflict, where the people of where there are communal clashes based mainly on ethnicity and religion between people of Buddhist Buddhist religious following and people of Muslim religious following in Myanmar, some of whom are Rohingya, but there are also many other ethnic Muslim groups in Myanmar who are not Rohingya, but who are also affected by that communal conflict. So that's a little bit what we mean by subnational conflict. If we can go on to the next slide, what we can see is this here is a little bit old. This data, this comes from about the middle of 2015. This data, but there are many tools that track the intensity of conflict around the region and follow all of the different conflicts that exist in the East Asia region or in Asia more broadly, and track the intensity of those conflicts. When we mean by the intensity of a conflict, we mean the degree of violence that is ongoing in those conflicts. This gives you a little bit of a look at the intensity of conflicts in different areas of Asia, and also the intensity of conflict in the areas that we will be talking about today. So the war level in Kachin and Karen, they are both areas of Myanmar, which have the highest level of intensity of conflict. They're both areas where I have undertaken research in the past. The limited war level is in the southern Thailand, the deep south, and then the violent crisis. There's a range of different Myanmar areas. Chin, KR, Mon, Shan state are all in Myanmar. You'll note that this was 2015, but I don't think it's changed. Papua is identified as an area of conflict intensity, and the last remaining area of conflict intensity in Indonesia. And there's some areas in the Philippines, and a few other areas, mainly in South Asia. As I mentioned before, this is old. It's 10 years old. And all of you will know that there has been a fundamental shift in the context in Myanmar over the last 3 years. an alarming shift in the context in Myanmar over the last 3 years, where the former military-led government moved towards a democratic-led government in 2012, and then for a period of 7 or 8 years, there was a democratic-led government. It did not mean there was not conflict in Myanmar. There continued to be conflict in Myanmar, but there is in the last 2 years, the military has retaken control of Myanmar, and so the ongoing subnational conflicts exist, but also sadly there's a large degree of violence in areas that were not previously experiencing conflict in Myanmar, and so that context has changed significantly. Next slide. Let's start off by talking to you about Myanmar, and the work that the examples we will discuss in Myanmar, I will take from 2 particular studies that I was responsible for leading. The first study is a study that is purely focused on access to justice. I worked for a project that was funded by the European Union and implemented by the British Council to provide access to justice, legal support for communities across Myanmar. And as part of that, I managed a study that is called Searching for the Law, Searching for Justice in the Law, Understanding Access to Justice in Myanmar. That was completed in 2017. The study is based on, and so the examples we will provide are based on a national survey across all of Myanmar, conflict-affected areas and non-conflict affected areas, to get the views of people across all of Myanmar on what they think justice is, what they think the law is, and how they think the government of Myanmar provides legal services and access to justice in Myanmar. A little note, the study did not take place in areas where there was ongoing conflict, just because it wasn't safe for researchers to go in and ask questions about the law in areas where there was ongoing conflict. So there's a little bit of a limitation there. But I also am going to draw from a study that I completed for the World Bank in Myanmar, which is a study on the National Community Driven Development Project in Myanmar. So many of you in Indonesia will be familiar with a Government of Indonesia project that used to be called PNPM, Program Nasional Pemberdayaan Masyarakat, which was a project which was present in every single village in Indonesia, and has now become the village law. So a main part of the village law. So the delivery of local infrastructure at the village level and providing approaches to deliver local infrastructure for communities that is owned by communities. Now, that project in Indonesia was supported by the World Bank, and the World Bank does a lot of this work across the region. And it was a project that I was closely involved in because we were looking mainly at issues relating to corruption in the project and so on. But in the process, a similar project was implemented in Myanmar prior to the new military regime taking over. And the project aimed to provide local infrastructure across Myanmar. It did so in 12,000 villages across Myanmar, in about 1/3 of the townships, if I remember correctly. And because Myanmar, if you have a look at the map that is on that presentation at the moment, all of the areas that are either in blue or with blue stripes through them are areas that are defined as conflict affected. So geographically speaking, that's almost half of the country. In terms of population and in terms of regions, townships, it's about 1/3 of the population. So about 1/3 of the townships are conflict affected. And if you are a project that implements across so many projects like the World Bank community-driven development project did, it is always going to overlap with areas of conflict. So the World Bank supported NCDDP project, about 1/3 of the projects they operated in, 22 projects, were in conflict regions. And they wanted to understand how the project works in conflict regions and how people deal with a project in conflict regions. And so I led a study on that. If we go on to the next slide, we'll see how complicated, when we talk about conflict, we'll see how complicated conflict is in Myanmar. So the next slide essentially shows you a breakdown of different conflicts and different armed organizations that are going on. And you'll see there's 13 or 14 different armed groups that are in conflict with the state, that are in conflict with the government of Myanmar in different areas. And as I'll discuss with you at some stage, there can be 3 or 4 different armed groups in conflict with the government in the same area. And in conflict with themselves often as well. So it's a very complicated picture, and it's a very, very complex context to work in. Overall, the way it was structured beforehand is that Myanmar had 13 or 14 regions and states. The regions were all the middle of Myanmar, and primarily where they are, where the majority of the population was Burma, ethnic Burma. And so the regions were, as you see there, less affected by conflict. And all of the states of the border areas of Myanmar, the areas that go on across the different borders, the vast majority of the states are different ethnicities, a range of different ethnicities. And so a lot of the conflict was, is based on people not necessarily wanting to be represented by or governed by ethnicities other than themselves. And that's just a very complex situation. We will go on to the next slide. And I'll just give you a really quick breakdown of what we mean by a conflict typology in Myanmar. And so what we see is that essentially there are what we identified through our work. There are probably 4 different types of conflict that you can define in Myanmar. The first type, and the type of less concern, is a type where there used to be a history of conflict, and there that still has some influence in the way of how people live and how people remember conflict and so on. But there's limited ongoing day-to-day violence continuing in that geographic area. The second part is where what we call EAOs, external armed organizations, ethnic armed organizations, what we call EAOs, they have influence, and to a large degree, there's a ceasefire. So in a range of geographic areas across Myanmar, the government has negotiated a ceasefire with the ethnic armed organizations, and that means that those armed organizations have a lot of influence in those areas, but there's no ongoing violence, but there's always the threat of violence. Some of those areas, one of the examples we'll talk about later is one of those areas. And some of those areas, you know, some areas, so one of the most famous tourist attractions in Myanmar is Inle Lakes in Shan State, beautiful lakes. Some of you may have had the fortune to visit that. That very few tourists that visit that will understand that that's a conflict area, and it's an area that is in a large part controlled by a group called the PNLO, the PAO, National Liberation Organization, and that they have a ceasefire with the government, and so they manage a lot of the services that are provided in those areas. We'll have an example based on that a little bit later. The next area is areas where EAOs pretty much have exclusive control. And the most famous of these is one of the largest and best resourced guerrilla groups. I wouldn't call it a guerrilla group anymore, but many of you will understand it if you understand a guerrilla group. Guerrilla groups in Asia, which is called the Wa State Army, the United Wa State Army, UWSA, which represents a people from Wa ethnicity. And it's a border area between China. Actually, it's mainly a border area between China and Myanmar, but they also control some territory between Thailand and Myanmar. And they are the sole the sole authority in that area. So they exercise what is called exclusive control in that area. The government of Myanmar has very limited control in that area. And the final area is an area where sadly there's still quite a lot of ongoing disputes, which is an area where there's still ongoing violent conflict. And that changes rapidly, but there are a number of areas where there's still daily conflicts, daily acts of violence between ethnic armed organizations and the government of Myanmar. So they're the types of conflict when we talk about conflict affected. They're the types of conflict we are talking about in Myanmar. We can then go to the next slide. You know, some time ago, I got asked to do some work in the south of Thailand, and they told me it was conflict-affected work. And I had no idea there was a conflict in the south of Thailand. So I think that most people would be unaware of the fact that there's an ongoing conflict in the south of Thailand. it is one of the longest ongoing conflicts in Asia. In recent years, in the last 15 years, it is also one of the most violent. It has claimed over 5,000 lives in the last 10 years or so. There are almost daily, I haven't followed it in the last 2 or 3 years. My understanding is that it's probably changed a fair bit. But at the time I was doing work there were almost daily acts of violence, small bombs, shootings, focused targeted shootings. It is a conflict that is sadly based on ethnic and religious lines. The 3 provinces in the deep south of Thailand, Pattani, Yala, and Narathiwat, are areas that claim to have a history as the Sultanate of Pattani. So they have a long history. They are about 80% Muslim provinces. So out of the 2 million people that live there, about 80% of those provinces are Malayu, have links to Malayu ethnicity, and are Muslim. Since about 2004, some of you may have remembered that 15 or 20 years ago, there was an awful, there was quite a series of violence occurring there. And there was an awful incident where I think about 30 or 40 Malayu who had been arrested were stuck on a bus, were stuck on a truck and suffocated on a truck, and about 40 people died as a result of that. But that was about 2004, the conflict became much more aggressive. And so for the last 10 or 15 years, there's been a small scale but ongoing violent conflict that occurs there. It is a complicated and complex situation. Neither parties, there's an armed group. It doesn't have very clear leadership. If I recall correctly, it was referred to as a Barisan Revolution movement or something like that, BRM. There have been a series of efforts to mediate peace, in particular efforts led by the Malaysian government. Sadly, none of which have progressed. And it's a very complex situation, but it's a situation that affects the lives of a lot of people there. It's a heavily militarized zone by the Thai military. And the Thai government also spends a lot of money there trying to provide services to gain the support of local communities. The World Bank delivered a project, a community development project there. And again, I was asked to go in and spend time to understand how that development project was working in a conflict-affected area. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Any questions at this stage? Does anyone have anything they want to add? Kalau lagi diam, mungkin saya lanjut aja ya. Kalau belum ada yang bertanya, I'll just continue. Feel free to stop and ask questions at any stage. What we want to understand next is so we've given you a little bit of a background on what subnational conflict looks like. And in particular, what it looks like in those in the areas we're going to discuss. What we want to understand next is a little bit. What we want to understand is firstly, what do we mean by legal disputes? and who do people look to help when they want to resolve legal disputes. The easiest way to do that, because mostly when you talk about this, people will kind of say, oh, what do you mean by dispute? And the easiest way to do this is to start off by giving you an example of what people refer to when they talk about disputes, and what are the most common types of disputes we're referring to. So the context here is that we are not talking about dispute resolution in the context of just the conflict. We're not talking about how to resolve the conflict. What we are talking about is how do people deal with their legal problems in areas that are affected by conflict. And everyone has legal problems all the time. And what we want to understand are what are the types of legal problems, and then how do they deal with those legal problems. So if we can go to the next slide, this will give you an example of in Myanmar. This is from the survey we conducted in Myanmar. This will give you an example of the types of legal problems that most people report. And then the degree varies a little bit from country to country, but normally if you ask people what their problems are in East Asia, the responses are reasonably similar. People have problems paying back debts. They have arguments about money. And that's pretty common. Those arguments can be with other people in their village. They can be with money lenders. They're often about power imbalances, because they're about people who work for someone who's borrowed money from a landowner or something like that, and then needs to pay it back. The next range of problems relate to crime and violence, fighting, theft, verbal abuse. These are, most of you will have studied criminal law, I assume at some stage, and these are problems that are pretty much the core of criminal law. The range of problems that are identified in pink there are administrative law in nature. They're problems that people have in terms of the services they get from the state, from the government. Often in conflict-affected areas, because the subnational is often one that is based on definitions of ethnicity. There are more commonly problems relating with legal documentation. People having difficulties getting birth certificates, people having difficulties getting ID cards, getting their KTPs, and so on. Those problems to many of you might seem minor, but they have a big consequence on people's lives, especially in a conflict context. For example, if we can use the context of Myanmar, and this is actually, I don't want to go into too much discussion on it because it's a very complicated and sensitive issue, but it's actually somewhat at the core of the issue relating to the Rohingya population in Myanmar, is a question of their legal identity. And that in theoretical level is very broad, but on a practical day-to-day level has a really big implication for people's lives, because if you can't get a birth certificate, or if you can only get, Myanmar has different levels of identity cards. So they have different types of identity cards based on your heritage. If you can't get particular types of identity cards, you're restricted from moving, you're restricted from finding work, and so on. Did I just see someone's hand shoot up?
Yes, someone just raised hand.
Yeah.
I saw. Who was it?
Maybe they put it back.
Daniati Murian, is that you, Daniati?
Possibly put it back down.
Okay, never mind.
All right. Okay, we'll continue. The next one is an obvious one, which is a whole bunch of issues, disputes relating to land. And here you have issues relating to transfer of land, disputes over who owns land, boundary disputes. In a conflict context, you often have a lot of very problematic and long-standing disputes over land grabbing. So when I first came to Indonesia, the types of legal services we were providing were supporting organizations that were trying to resolve long-standing land grabbing processes from the Suharto era, from businesses in the Suharto area that pretty much through different means took land of communities. Some of those means were negotiated, some of those means were using force, and these were disputes that tried to return the land to those communities. A major issue that we that often occurred in Myanmar was similar issues about villages that have lost land to the military. In some instances, because the military needed to build bases and so on for military purposes. But in some instances, because the military had connections with business and business wanted access to the land. And so they used the conflict context to issue land to cause land problems. And there you see in Myanmar, about 7% of disputes that were identified relate to land grabbing. And most of those would have been relating to land disputes in conflict affected areas. Then there's family issues, family law issues, domestic violence, inheritance, divorce, and so on. And the last one are vehicle accidents and negotiating vehicle accidents. So they're kind of like the core type of disputes that that occur. What I want to do, and we'll see how participatory all of this is. We'll see the degree to which are participatory. If you have a look at those type of disputes, what I would like from you is your initial thoughts on if you were someone who was living in a village in North Sumatra or anywhere else in Indonesia or the Philippines where you are or so on, and you faced some of these disputes, I would like your initial thoughts on who you would try and get help from, who you would visit as a first step to try and give you assistance in resolving those disputes. And what I'd suggest is we take a couple of minutes and you in the chat, you write who the first person comes to mind that you think would help in that kind of dispute. And we'll see what some of the responses are. And just because my accent is so strange, I'll just repeat for most of you in Indonesian. I'll repeat for you in Indonesian the instructions so you can give us some examples for that. Jadi kalau saya bisa usul, kita ini ambil waktunya sedikit, mungkin 2-3 menit untuk mendengar pendapatan dari teman-teman. Kalau saya boleh usul di chat, teman-teman lagi fikir jika teman-teman punya masalah legal kayak yang saya sebut tadi, yang contoh-contoh yang saya sebut tadi, jika punya masalah kayak gitu, kira-kira Anda akan cari solusinya di mana? Anda akan siapa yang Anda akan kunjungi untuk memberi bantuan di dalam proses penyelesaian masalah atau penyelesaian masalah tersebut. Kalau bisa kita ambil 2-3 menit, tolong masukin masukan, tolong masukin jawaban di chat. Belum ada yang berani jawab ya. Silakan yang lain. Ya. Ya. Mungkin ada teman-teman memang dari daerah yang kita sebut rural, daerah agak petani, atau daerah ada yang mungkin datang dari lahir dan besar di desa-desa, mungkin punya pengalaman yang beda dengan orang yang dari perkotaan. Ya. Ada lagi? Oke, kalau orang memang if you're more interested in listening, or maybe you're at the moment as we're speaking, making a coffee or something, and sibuk mengetik, maybe we'll continue, and we can go and have a look at the solution langsung, and you can think about that. So if we go down 2 slides, Bang Robert. Next one. Okay. So this is the response that you get from, and this response is not enormously different than you get from a lot of other countries in the region, right? This is a response you get from Myanmar. Who is the most responsible actor for the following tasks: maintaining safety and security, preventing crime, investigating crime, determining guilt or innocence, punishing those guilty of crime, settling issues between disputes. So there are different types of dispute resolution processes. And over 50% of people we surveyed for every single one of those dispute resolution processes said that the most responsible actor is what is determined as the WVTA, which is the Ward and Village Tract Administrator. Now, the Ward and Village Tract Administrator, Myanmar, maybe for its sins, is an old British colony, and so they use this concept of wards and tracts. The Ward and Village Tract Administrator is essentially would be someone like a Kepala Desa in the Indonesia context. It is someone who is responsible for a number of villages, for between 3 and 6 or 7 villages. In the Achinese context, it would be more similar to someone who would be defined as the mukim. I'm not sure. It's not necessarily a position that is familiar elsewhere in other parts of Indonesia. But actually, it's a little bit different from the mukim in the Achinese context, because the Ward and Village Tract Administrator is an official government position. It is someone that is appointed, often in the past elected, but it's akin to the village, the Kepala Desa or the Gucik in the Indonesian context. And they are identified across the board as having the most responsibility for resolving anything. It is not dissimilar to Indonesia, and we'll give you some examples in a little bit. In the Indonesia context, the village head is often the person who is identified as having the most power to resolve anything. If we go down to the next slide, the next most influential people are what is termed the 10 or 100-headed household leader, and that is the Kepala Dusun, the equivalent to a Kepala Dusun. So they are identified as the next most influential leader. And the third most influential leader is a community elder. And I noticed one of our students mentioned the Adat chief, which would be identified as a community leader. And I see also the column, a colleague from the Philippines has suggested local community leaders and the barangay officials. So the village tract administrator would be similar to a barangay official in the Philippines, to the context of a barangay official in the Philippines. So you will see, if you go back one slide, Bang Robert, you'll see that very few respondents look to formal government positions as a part of their solution for dealing with legal problems. For investigating crimes, 20 or 30% will go to a little bit over 30% view the police as having an important role in that. And for preventing crime, about 20% view the police. Most people in common context would think that as soon as you mention crime, the police is the first point of call. But at a rural level, at least in Myanmar, that is not the case. The ward and village tract administrator has the most important role in that context. If we go down a couple of slides, 2 slides, I want to give you an example, comparison example from work I mentioned earlier, where we conducted surveys in Aceh and in Maluku. This is about 10 years ago, but it doesn't show, it shows a little bit less influence on these figures, but it doesn't show a lot less influence on these figures, where in Aceh, 53% of the population suggested that if they had an issue, they would go to a village head. And that was followed by hamlet head with Dusun, and then family and friends, and only 7%. The only government formal legal institution captured in the survey would be the police at about 7%. The figures are higher in government institutions in Maluku, and this was 15 years ago. So, hi. Ada pertanyaan?
I think he unmuted his mic by accidentally.
Okay. So Maluku, about 25% of people identified government actors outside of the village, the police and the sub-district head, the Kepala Camat, the Camat, which is higher than other areas. So the figures that are discussed in Myanmar are not significantly different from what is common in Indonesia as well. And then we go to the next series of slides, and what we see is that these are surveys that ask people why they use particular actors, why they use a ward and village tract administrator, why they use a 10 household and 100 household head of a community leader. And you can see the most common ones is because A, they're accessible, they are easy to access. B, they use language which is more familiar to a community member, either in terms of the particular language that is used or in terms of being able to understand the words and so on. And C, they are reliable and respectful. So they have more confidence, they have more legitimacy from a point of view of a community member. They have more legitimacy than, if we go on to the next slide, we will see in the next slide that the similar question, boleh lanjut? Yeah, okay. The similar question was asked of lawyers, police, and judges. And the responses in the deep red show that the main view that people see here is that they use a similar language because they speak the same, they come from the same language background. but very few people saw lawyers or the police, and even fewer saw judges as being accessible, affordable, reliable, or respectful. So people who have a dispute at a village level, they will go to someone who has the most legitimacy in their eyes, and that most often, more often than not, will be a village leader. So if we go to the next slide, we want to have a look at what the implications of that are in both southern Thailand and in Myanmar. And so let's start with a case of southern Thailand. The case of southern Thailand is and was very complex. The conflict in southern Thailand, one of the ways that the government of Thailand tried to address the conflict was to put money into the 3 provinces in southern Thailand. So it built infrastructure. The highways are the best highways I've ever been on. The local services are great local services. Internet's fantastic everywhere. The schools and hospitals are quite high quality. The government put a lot of money into those provinces. But because of the security context, it had a limited capacity to deliver services. The conflict, the guerrilla movements in southern Thailand, the rebel movements in southern Thailand, were targeting government actors as a message to the community, not to support the government. So teachers in government schools, people who were putting up electricity poles and so on, they were targets by the armed groups. And so the government was putting a lot of money in an area where it had a limited ability to deliver the services. It had fewer options to deliver the services. And this was problematic because it meant that it put the money into villages. It went, well, okay, well, the easiest solution to this is to put more money to village administrations, what were called the Tambon administrative offices, which are the sub-district office, the TAO, which is the equivalent to the Kacamatan here, and also to development, social and economic development offices and village heads. And it put money into these positions. When you put money, resources into positions like this, it makes them much more political. It means people are interested in capturing positions. And so what the effect is that it placed a lot of politics on the village, what we call village governance, on the village institutions. It made those institutions really hard to manage. And that in turn led to disputes about the money involved, about how the money was being used, about who was trying to use the money, and about perceptions that some groups weren't getting the money or services as much as other groups, which in turn inflamed the conflict. Because one of the main driving, the conflict is complex there, but one of the driving factors of a conflict there is this sense that people in southern Thailand are being treated differently to people elsewhere in Thailand. And so that's a grievance that influences a conflict. So you have this circle of the government trying to respond to it by putting money into it. That creates problems, which then creates a bigger conflict. So the government tries to respond to it by putting more money into it. And so, what's wrong, baby? What's wrong? Yeah, can you hang on 1 second? I'll try and get some to you. Yeah. Maaf ya, anak saya lagi sakit hari ini, jadi harus saya ini coba.
Oke, Gewesun Gila.
Mau ketemu sama Om Nat di bawah? Oke, saya akan coba lanjut sedikitnya. Kami yang dulu kalau ya. Kami. Okay, so that's the context in the southern Thailand in terms of the village governance. If we move now on to the context in Myanmar, Myanmar is, as all of these areas are complex, yeah, but Myanmar is complex. Myanmar has a dual complexity. Yeah, I know, baby, I know. Aku lagi mengajar. Say hi, Tom. Okay. Myanmar has a dual complexity, right? The first one is that Myanmar, since independence in the 1960s, or since the 1960s, has had a government, a state system that has really tried to minimize interaction across the country, to minimize interaction between communities and the state. So across the country, what you will see in rural communities in Myanmar is, yeah, I know, baby. Across the country, what you'll see in rural communities in Myanmar is the government trying to get rural communities. Do you want to watch? Just hang on 1 second, please. Do you want to watch this? That's funny. Any other Snoopy? That's Snoopy. Yeah, I know, baby. Okay, so what you'll see in Myanmar is a context where the government has had limited financial capacity and limited capacity to deliver services, and so it has tried to make villages self-sufficient. It is in the interest of most rural villages in Myanmar not to engage with the government because that creates problems. So you will see in villages build their own roads. Villages figure out their own issues about accessing water. They figure out their own electricity supplies because they know that there's limited government budget to do that. And they also know that engaging with the government can be problematic. And so it's better trying not to engage with the government. Now, outside of that, in conflict areas, it's even more complicated because you have multiple people trying to be the government. And so I include a photo here of a meeting we sat through where we were in the meeting interviewing a normal Burmese Myanmar respondent in a village in KR state, which is one of the least developed states and has a long-standing conflict with the KNLU, the KR National Liberation Union. And the meeting is with a resident from the village and with a village leader. And we were accompanied by the government administrative department, the GAD, who were implementing a project. And halfway through the meeting, the guy in the orange t-shirt came in and joined the meeting. He was invited into the meeting by the GAD, the government administrative department. And it was clear that there was some complexity here. But after the meeting, we went and had lunch, and it became somewhat clear that the person was actually a representative from the KNLU, the ethnic armed organization, who was wanting to follow what was happening with these visits, who was in communication with government authorities and able to travel freely in these areas and also have a lot of influence in these areas, but was not directly identified as someone having a position of power. So village governance context in Myanmar is very complicated. We have an example here in Pole State, where if you go to the next slides, but I'll go through this pretty quickly because I'm conscious that we are. Let's skip the example from Pole State. If we go down 2 more slides, what essentially you have the problem is that you have areas where because of a conflict, the village position has more influence than it would normally have. Because people don't want to engage with the government or the state. People are scared to engage with the state because they're scared of the risks associated with that. People know that there are both the government, the state, and ethnic armed groups or armed groups in general that negotiate and have influence. And so someone has to negotiate a middle path for villages to try and minimize this. So for a village leader in a conflict-affected area, essentially they become what we in English call the gatekeeper. They become the person who decides what problems get resolved locally and what problems need to be referred to another actor. And in some instances, they have additional funds to do that because the state is not capable of delivering services. So the state provides funding for the village to do that. And they also have a lot of community legitimacy because a lot of people in the village recognize that it's an incredibly difficult position. And so they're grateful that someone does that position. And normally they're grateful that it's not them, but it's someone else that does that position. And so that person has a lot of stature in the village. But the problem is that that it's a risky job. It's a job that is constantly trying to please not only your community, but also the government and armed groups in the area. And it's a constant negotiation about what can be provided and so on. And ultimately a job that is involves risks personal to personal safety of a village leader and to their family. So Bang Robert, if we can go back to the example 2 slides beforehand, we'll show you some of this, right? So this is a case we saw, which was a motorbike theft in the area I mentioned before, the Pao Autonomous Region, which is around Inle Lake, which is controlled by the Pao National Organization, the PNO. A villager stole a motorbike in a neighboring village. And the case was reported to the village head. And in order to resolve the dispute, the village head had to report it not to the government of Myanmar, but to the head of the village representation in the Pao National Organization. And in the end, they had to come up with a compensation that involved a fine paid for the stolen motorbike, a fine paid to the other village for the bad reputation that had been brought on the village itself, and an apology fee paid to the ethnic armed organization, the representatives of the ethnic armed organization. Now, whether or not the person who was responsible for stealing the bike agreed with those forms of compensation, they had to follow it, because if they did not follow it, the village said they would send it to the government police. And the consequences of sending it to the government police were so much worse than the consequences of dealing with this particular outcome. So the village head is the one that decided when to deal with things locally and when to send it through. And villagers had limited capacity to influence that decision, and in most cases had to accept that decision. Now, if we go down a few slides, in most instances, this is the preferred way of resolving disputes in areas of conflict, because it keeps people out of the spotlight. It keeps people away from actors who interaction with might have significant impacts. If we go down the other way, please, Robert, to slide 25. Keep on going. Slide 25. The only problem with keep on going way down. Ini terbalik, the other way. Next one. Next one. The only problem with this approach is that there's people that don't benefit from it. There's people that have no options, that are more vulnerable than they normally would be because of their position, because of their gender, because of their ethnicity, because of their religion. And so there's risks involved. So here we have a series of different quotes from women, from people from religious minorities in southern Thailand and in Myanmar. You have a quote from someone from a Muslim religious faith in Myanmar, showing that in a conflict-affected area, showing that they're not as free as in the past. Any small case is immediately made into a big case. You have people talking about legal identity in Molomyai in the south of Myanmar, which is a conflict-affected area. You have people talking about accessing information if you're a Buddhist in Muslim majority southern Thailand. You have cases about women with limited capacity to deal with disputes. We go to the next slide. What you'll see is a problem here is that specific groups, and this is a survey asking women with low education in Myanmar, you'll see that in responses to key questions, the response rate for them is double all other respondents. Do you know about human rights? 75% of women with low education in rural Myanmar have no idea about human rights. Only 44% of the rest of the population don't. Do you know about state courts? What if people use state courts are saying? If you had to get information, do you know where you get information? Double the number of women in rural areas don't know where to get information. So the problem is that it's a similar experience everywhere, that particular groups, vulnerable groups, have less access to justice and less access to the law than other groups elsewhere. But this is exacerbated in conflict-affected areas. People from ethnic minorities in a village, the village approach to resolving disputes is a consensus-based approach. People from ethnic minorities, it means that if they're involved in a dispute, they have to agree with the consensus. They are the ones that have to compromise. The types of punishment that are sometimes imposed are not consistent with principles of national law or basic principles of human rights. So the types of punishment that people have to accept, that are developed by local by villages, by village leaders, in times are unjust and provide an added burden on vulnerable groups. So I mean, I'll wrap up by suggesting to you all that it's really important that we understand how, when we talk about legal issues and delivery of justice services, it's really important that we understand what that means for people locally, And in order to do that, it's important to understand how they go about accessing legal services. And what I've tried to explain to you today is that is additionally complicated for people that live in areas that are affected by conflict, and that it's an area that is worthy of ongoing study. And hopefully some of you as students will move towards focusing on issues like that. And it's an area that is of importance and of ongoing importance across the Asia Pacific region. So, Robert, I might leave it there. I know that people haven't been leaving questions, but I'm happy to continue to answer any questions that people might have.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Matt. I think there's someone asked question by you asked a question in the chat box. I find the question for you. Okay. Okay, can you see the question, Matt? Hey, sorry, I I copied the wrong message. Okay, there you are. I'm sorry, you are mute. You're muted.
Apologies. Yes, there you go. So the question you ask is about the conflict resolution process, right? And the challenge is that conflicts are structural, and so the process of resolving or influencing a conflict is something that is not always very easy to do from a village level, right? So the conflict resolution is, in most cases, something that occurs between the state and armed actors who represent ethnic armed groups. And the resolution is a very, the resolution of those conflicts is something that is beyond the scope of local actors in influencing. And so one of the areas we looked at in southern Thailand that our study was specifically aimed to look at is to what extent could local programs at village levels affect the conflict context? And our answer to that was that it could not positively affect the conflict context, because the conflict context is something that is at a structural level that is well beyond the local. But the response is that poorly addressing these issues can negatively affect the conflict context. So not having good conflict resolution, not having good dispute resolution processes in place negatively affects the conflict, because the conflict is about grievances. It's about particular groups mobilizing grievances that communities have against the state. And if you're delivering services as a state and you're perceived as poorly delivering those services, then you're exacerbating or you're increasing those grievances. So the response is to say, let's putting in place areas to address disputes locally is not going to lead to a peace settlement, but it's going to take away some of the barriers to what is minimizing peace. It's going to take away some of the grievances that people feel that drive the conflict, that inflame the conflict. I hope that responds to your question, Bayuya.
Okay. Mr. Bayu, does that answer your question? Oh, I think Jihad from Brawijaya raised her hand.
Yes.
Yes, Jihad? Oh, he's okay. Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Robert. Hello, good morning, Mr. Matt. I would like to ask regarding the enforcement of a settlement when a dispute is settled by adat chief or its equivalent, such as the case mentioned earlier. There's 300,000 kyats for the stolen motorcycle, etc., etc. How when it comes to the enforcement, when it is in court, they have court could issue a warrant to the police, but if it's settled outside the court, what are the challenges when it comes to the enforcement of the settlement or the award? Thank you.
Thanks, Bang Ziad. That's a great question. The most influential enforcement tool available locally is the threat of sending a dispute to the police. And so there's actually a combination of two tools, right? The first one is that if people do not agree with the outcome or do not follow the outcome, the leaders will threaten to send it to the state. They will threaten to send a dispute to a state level, to the police or to the courts or so on. And the risks involved in that are so significant that it leads to a capacity to enforce a dispute. The second response, which is possibly a more positive take on it, is the question of social stigma in people's communities. And enforcement is based on social cohesion and on social stigma. If someone is not following an outcome, there will be pressure from within the community. Normally within the community, that means their family, their neighbors, and so on, to follow that, to follow the outcome. So a combination of a threat to refer the case to the formal system with social stigma attached is generally what leads to very high enforcement rates.
Yeah. Okay. Mr. Jihad, does that answer the question?
I think thank you for the answer. It answered my curiosity about the regarding the enforcement. Thank you, Mr. Matthews.
Thanks, but yeah.
Mohammed, just another question from Jihan Rafifa from Universitas in the chat box.
Yes. Gaps between our personal interest between our government based on your highlight. Would you mind to explain how about build a good communication between our village government or local community leader and village? Thank you so much in your advance. Again, thanks, Jihan. It's a great question. I think one of the main issues is actually about legal information and access to information. What is most important, what is an important tool in overcoming weaknesses in the system relates to providing people with options. And providing people with options means letting them understand what their rights are and what different options exist for them. And in part that is about, so my view is that in part that is about building the quality of local leaders, both building a quality of local leaders to undertake the important jobs, local leaders, I mean village government, mainly to undertake important jobs that are entrusted to them. In conflict areas, it's even more complicated because so many, and unfortunately, these are normally men, right? The number of village leaders who are women is still reasonably low throughout the region. But in conflict areas, the problem is that so many men in the age bracket that is a village leader age bracket don't stay around conflict areas, right? Because of the risks involved of being caught in a conflict, of being asked to become a member of either the ethnic armed group or the government. So the capacity of village leaders is weakened because the choices, the options available are weakened. But in my mind, what's important is providing ways to strengthen the quality of a village government, but equally providing access to information for community members more broadly, to understand that they have options and that there are pros and cons in all of the options available to them, but they should be in a position to make choice about those options. I hope that answers your question, Kajihan.
Okay. Does that answer the question, Jihan? Okay, I guess you got it. Okay, any other questions from the participants? Okay, Mangmet, maybe I want to ask you a question. Based on your experience and knowledge, what's the common cause of subnational conflicts in Myanmar, southern Thailand, or even Indonesia, besides the ethnic and religion issue? And what can we do to prevent this kind of conflicts in the future?
So I mean, I'll try and explain it in a simplistic way. I have having had research experience in a number of different conflict areas across the region, I have a point of view that the one thing that we can do is to understand that people, human beings everywhere, just want to live their life. And they want to live their life in a way that is fair, that they're treated fairly, and that they're allowed to look after their family, they're allowed to find work to help their family, they're allowed to go about their daily life without being harassed. People, and the research that we undertook in Myanmar highlights this, right? People do not know about laws, but they know what justice is. They know what is just and what is unjust. And people are the same everywhere, right? So my view is that the fundamental starting point is to deliver services or to treat citizens in a way that respects who they are, in a way that respects people equally wherever. And that is delivery of services in a way that doesn't ask for bribes, that doesn't prioritize some people over other people depending on their gender or their ethnicity or their religion or so on. But a way that respects human beings as human beings. And to the extent that governments can do that as much as possible, that will reduce the types of grievances that may lead to people to create conflict. Now, that might be a little bit simplified and idealistic, but I think it's an important starting point for how governments interact with their citizens.
Okay, thank you, Mangmet, for your answer. I think the time is up. Let's conclude our session for today. Thank you, Bang Matt, for the wonderful presentation. Let us give applause to Bang Matt. The fifth word applause, everybody. Okay, this concludes our meeting for today. Dear participants, please remember we have another session with Prof. Luntong on 20th July 2022, the same time. Professor Luntong will deliver his lecture on Rakusit Alu. Please remember to join the session, and the meeting ID will be shared on the WhatsApp group. Thank you. Okay, everybody, thank you for your time. See you
Thanks
in
so much,
the next
everyone.
class. Thank you, Bang Matt.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye. See you, everyone.
leave,
Take
yeah.
care. Stay safe, stay healthy.
Take care.